Okay. Thank you very much for coming. This presentation is Drama, How Your DRAM Becomes a Security Problem. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here today with Michael. Michael and I did concurrent research, meaning that we're actually competitors rather than cooperators. And it's a bit weird standing here as an old hacker type, for lack of a better word, and be here with a young academic like Michael. But I think it's a great thing that we have sufficient mutual respect for each other that we can do this presentation together. Well, anyways, let's get on with the technical stuff. This talk is about how DRAM leaks information across security boundaries. What it's not about is software. It's often perceived that if we fix all the software bugs, that we will have safe computing. However, if the underlying hardware is not inherently safe, then we have an insecurity problem. So we have found what we think is a design problem with DRAM, and we can use that as an attack vector. The word design is chosen with intent here. It's not a bug. It's not like Rowhammer where you have a reliability problem in the production of DRAM. It is very much to the way that DRAM works instead. So we will be focused on an Intel x86-64. The problem that we identified is in DRAM, meaning that it applies to other platforms as well. So you should just keep that in mind going through this talk. So the takeaways that we want you to have when you go is that DRAM design is security relevant, and specifically that DRAM leaks information. We can use this information to extract information cross VM, cross CPU. We can spy on other software, and we can use the information that DRAM leaks to enable efficient and targeted Rowhammer attacks. So we're going to start right off with a demo. And for the demo, we're going to need a random number between 100 and 1,000. So if anybody has a random number, just scream it out. Otherwise, take the last digits off your credit card and shout them out.
914.
914.
486.
We switch to demo, please.
Yeah, it's switched. So what we can see here now is we have a virtual machine on the right side running a normal Linux operating system with a shell in here, and I can show you we don't have any access to the internet. We only have the loopback adapter, no internet connection. On the left side we have Firefox running on our host system, and that is of course connected to the internet. And our goal is to extract information from the virtual machine and send it to the browser so we can get it to the internet. And during I docked the JavaScript in the browser, did some stuff on DRAM, found vulnerable pages, and then now I should be able, now I did the same in the virtual machine, they have now a channel open, and I should be able to get information out of the virtual machine to the browser. So the number was 914, right? So we transmit the 9, 1. It's not the fastest, but it should be quite reliable. And we can really see I type in the virtual machine and get the numbers out of the virtual machine without any connection between the virtual machine and the host system on the outside. And your credit card number, or whatever this was, your CCV, I don't know, is now on the internet. Good, so switch back to the slides. Can we switch back to the slides? Yeah, perfect. So what did you see here? There were no software bugs. We used 0 software bugs for this demo, and we had a real covered communication from the virtual machine to the internet, and we just had a JavaScript running on the host system, no binary on the host system. And this isn't magic. And in the remaining talk, we are going to present all the backgrounds and what exactly we did here to make that work. But first, who are we? My name is Michael Schwarz. I'm a student, a PhD student at Graz University of Technology. You can find me on Twitter, you can write me an email, you can come to me afterwards so that we can, if you have any questions, want to talk. And I'm part of a research team at Graz University of Technology, consisting of Peter Bessel, Daniel Groß, Clementine Maurice, and Stefan Mangard. And together we did a lot of research on this DRAM stuff, and also published a paper for the first part of this, all the backgrounds, at the Usenix Security Conference in August. And this talk is then the extension of this paper with all the new cool features we have here.
So my name is Anders Fogh. I'm a principal security researcher with GData Advanced Analytics, and you can reach me on Twitter and by email as well. So usually we want to leak secrets. There's nothing funny in leaking stuff that isn't secret, and secrets are usually managed by software and computers. So we need to find out how we go from software to DRAM, and here our software is symbolized with a move instruction, x86 instruction, and DRAM is symbolized by a capacitor. If you're asking yourself why a capacitor, well, DRAM stores data in capacitors. There's a capacitor for each bit. If the capacitor is charged, the bit is 1. If it's discharged, it's 0. So we need to find out how we get from this move instruction to these capacitors. And the first thing that happens when we run this move instruction is that we discover that the 4141 in the last slide is a virtual address of the current process. However, the CPU needs a physical address to talk to DRAM, and consequently we need to do a bit of translation. So why do we need to do translation? Well, back in the late 80s, early 90s, Intel decided it was a wonderful idea if we could run more than one process securely on a single CPU. And the way they implemented this was that they gave each application its own private virtual address space, and then have a mapping for each process from virtual memory to physical memory. The exchangeability is that each process has its own. That is, when the operating system or kernel swaps process, it will just swap the mapping and everything will work fine. This also creates a choke point where every memory instruction has to go through, and this choke point can be used for checking privileges on memory access, and this is what is happening. The operating system usually takes care of these tables, and if you have a hypervisor in your system, it has a second go on the memory accesses. What actually happens looks something like this. In the upper left corner, you have the CR3 register. This is where the exchangeability comes in. The operating system uses this register to swap table every time it swaps process. Down below, you have the virtual address, and you see the uppermost bits are going into this 4-level translation table called the page tables. Only the upper bits are actually used to translate something. So usually we translate to 4 kilobytes. The rest of the bits are taken once directly from the virtual address and added to the physical address. So we're doing translation on a page level, and pages are almost always 4 kilobyte large. There are exceptions, but almost always. That is, of course, a bit quick for me to summarize the paging operation of modern CPUs and operating systems. So we have a summary slide here of what is important for you to remember. Well, what is important is the most significant bit of the virtual address determines the page. The page is almost 4 kilobyte large, and the least significant bits, almost always 12 of them, is the offset into the page. Only the page is translated and thus security checked. So these are the facts that are going to turn into a violation of an assumption later on. So it should also be mentioned that these page tables, this is the entire security check there is for memory on the x86, meaning that beyond this point, the CPU will think that everything is good and dandy. There will be no more security checks. Once we clear the page tables in security check, we run into the data caches. The story here is that DRAM is relatively slow to modern CPUs, and the idea with caches is that you store frequently used memory for the CPU and have every memory reference go through it. The caches are so built that they are transparent to the operating systems and to programs and to hypervisors and everything else. We here, as attackers, have a problem with caches. That is, we want to talk to DRAM because that's where we have our problem. So we need to bypass them. We need to bypass this roadblock. And we can do this in two ways. The easy way is that Intel provides an unprivileged instruction. Actually, there's two of them, CL flush and CL flush up. Unprivileged for cache maintenance by applications. We can use that to bypass the cache. You saw JavaScript, and in JavaScript we don't have access to any special instructions like the CL flush instructions. So we need to use a technique called evict. There is a paper by Gruss, Maurice, and Mangard on this subject. called Rowhammer.js that describes how we can evict stuff from the cache and thus bypass it. We'll leave it at that there. Once we have passed the data caches, we arrive in the memory controller. The memory controller does a lot of stuff, but the thing we're interested in here is it has a mapping function. So this is where the physical addresses is taken as input, and through the map, the capacitor that stores the data we want to read is found, which will take us to how is DRAM actually organized, so that you have an idea how this map is used. What you see here is a DIMM. This is what you buy if you go to a store and buy DRAM. And you can have one or more DIMM in your computer, and they are connected to the CPU through channels. And either the DIMM has a front side and a back side, and these are called ranks. And on the ranks, we have a number of chips. And if we open up the chips, we'll see we have a number of banks inside. Each of these banks have a row buffer. We're going to be talking a lot about the row buffer in a moment. For now, we'll just have a look what's inside one of these 32,000 rows of the bank. And you probably guessed it, this is where we have our capacitors. The capacitors are part of a cell, and a cell consists of a capacitor and a transistor each. This means that each bit takes only 2 electronic components to be stored. The capacitor is there for control so that we actually get a chance to read and write the bit. Now, here, so that we don't bore you too long before it gets security related, this is the first hint of trouble. A row is 64,000 cells, meaning it's 8 kilobytes large, and security was checked for 4 kilobyte blocks. So we have here first hint of trouble. This means that security domains may end up sharing rows. We're going to talk a lot about this. We just didn't want to bore you. So we're going to talk about how DRAM actually works, how you read from DRAM. And internally, DRAM is only capable of reading entire rows. This is a design decision so that you can maintain only 2 components for storing a bit, meaning that the entire overhead are for a very large number of bits. So internally, it can only read entire rows. Also, capacitors in cells discharge when you read the bits. What I mean by that is if you take a capacitor and put a voltmeter on it, if the capacitor is charged, you'll see a short spike, and you'll never see anything again. So reading DRAM actually destroys the content of the cells. And the solution is, of course, we read the bits out, put them in a buffer, and write them back when you're done. And this is the row buffer. This is why we have it here. So say the CPU wants to read something in the yellow row here. That is the first row. And the row buffer is empty. So the CPU tells us we need something from this row, and then we activate it. Activating is nothing more than essentially copying the row to the row buffer. Nothing more. Just copy it to the row buffer. And then we can extract the bits that we needed from the row and return it to the CPU. So now it becomes funny. If the CPU immediately afterwards decides it needs to read some stuff from the same row again, maybe some other stuff in the row, well, now the row buffer is already full, and the CPU can get it directly from here. This sounds like it's less work, and the question is it faster? In fact, this very question was what got me into researching this stuff. So what we did was we measured the latency of row hits, that is when the information that we are trying to read is already in the row buffer. And we got this nice graph. And then we measured the latency of reading from memory when there's a row conflict or row miss, that is when the data we're reading is not in the row buffer, it has to activate the row before. And if we put these two together, we can see that there is a very nice threshold that half of them, the green, the row hits is almost always faster than the row misses, meaning we're able to distinguish from outside if a row was in the row buffer or not. So we can just summarize everything up to here. Security is typically checked for 4 kilobyte pages. We can bypass the data caches to read from DRAM. Pages of different security domains can share banks. Pages of different security domains can share rows. And through timing, we can establish row hits and misses across security boundaries. and the total result is DRAM leaks information.
So now that we have a background on the DRAM and we know how the DRAM is organized, we can do our first attack and do a reverse engineering of the CPU. So you remember this slide, we had that a few minutes ago in the background. That's the mapping function of the memory controller. So if you have data that has a virtual address and then it translates to the physical address, the physical address gets to the memory controller, and the memory controller then uses a function to decide in which location of the DIMM the data is actually stored. This is this mapping function. So this is a mapping function of a Skylake computer here, and the problem is we don't know this mapping function. So this is not documented. This is a secret. Intel keeps it secret. They don't want anyone to know this mapping function. But we are really interested in this mapping function. So we really want to know if we have a physical address, where is this data stored in the actual DRAM, in which bank, in which channel, in which rank, in which chip. We really want to know this, and that's why we need the mapping function. And as it is undocumented, we have to reverse engineer it. And we want to do it only in software. So we could do that with hardware measurements, but we wanted to do it in software. And we already know we have timing differences. So we want to exploit those timing differences to really reverse engineer the mapping function from the timing differences only. And here's an animation about our approach, so what we actually do. So you can see here a DIMM, and it has the chips on it, and we call each chip a bank. And then we see that this is numbered rectangles in there that are the rows of the banks in the DRAM. And then we just start with one random address. We just take one completely random address, and this address will be somewhere in the DRAM. And it will be in one bank. We don't know which bank, but it will be in some bank. And then we select more random addresses. So the first one is our base address, and then we select more random addresses. And then we hammer these addresses. So we access the base address and the other address. And then again the base address, the other address, and so on. And we measure the timing it takes to hammer those addresses. And if they are in different banks, then that's quite fast, because they don't influence the row buffer. They each have their own row buffer. It can be served in parallel. So we see fast timings if we choose random addresses that are not in the same bank. And if we find an address that maps to the same bank in the DIMM, then the timing is worse. So it's much slower, because now we have two addresses in the same bank but in different rows. And that means it always has to overwrite the row buffer. You remember the row buffer from before? If I access the first address, it gets copied to the row buffer. If I access the second address, it has to be copied over the row buffer. So that will be slower. And then we can see if addresses map to the same bank or if they don't map to the same bank. And then we choose another random base address and do this again over and over, and we again see addresses that map to the same bank have high timing, different banks, low timings. And we can do that for all the banks we have in the DRAM. We choose random base addresses from every bank and then find addresses that map to the same bank using those timing differences. And then we have for each bank a set of addresses that map there. And we can see that as a linear equation system. So we have the physical address as the coefficients, and we have the bank number as the right side of the equation. And then we have a few equations and a few coefficients, and we could solve that. And if we solve that, we get the mapping functions. But as we were a bit lazy when doing that, we didn't want to write an equation solver, so we did brute force. And that might sound slow, but it was really fast. So brute forcing the equation system, you only have zeros or ones as coefficients, and you only have up to 30 coefficients. That's very fast. So it was in the order of seconds to minutes, depending on the computer. The fastest result, for example, on this computer, was 6 seconds from starting the measurement until having the mapping function, and the slow part was the measurement. So brute forcing the equation system took a fraction of a second. And we developed a toolkit that does that fully automated. So we wanted to have that on a lot of computers. So we did a fully automated toolkit to reverse engineer the mapping. And that's really fast, depending on how much memory you have between seconds and minutes. We open sourced that tool, so it's available on GitHub. And you can just right now pull the repository, compile a program, running on your computer, and hopefully until the end of the talk you will have the mapping function, and you can compare it to the ones we have in our paper. And we did it for a few machines, so if you have the same machine, you will hopefully get the same mapping function. For new machines you get new mapping functions, so you can really try that out. You don't have to do anything, just start the program and wait. So what we now have is a toolkit that gives us the mapping function for every computer, and we know which physical address maps to which part of the DRAM. And we can do that everywhere, fully automated, and now we want to exploit that knowledge. So we have that knowledge now we want to exploit it with some attacks.
So the first thing we want to exploit here is we want to spy on other people's software through the DRAM. And imagine this function. It is really an imaginary function. It's inspired from a real function that leaks a lot more information than this one does. Imagine you have a scan code from the keyboard coming in. If it's uppercase, it goes into a handle uppercase function. If it's lowercase, it goes into a handle lowercase function. Now, functions are memory as well, meaning that different memory will be touched if the handle uppercase function is called than when the handle lowercase function is called. So we're going to see if we can figure out which of these two functions are called and whether your password uses uppercase letters or lowercase letters. So here we want to remember handle uppercase, handle lowercase, different memory. So we want to spy on the behavior of a victim. And the victim actually won't know that we're spying on him because he will not be seeing that what we're doing in DRAM. His software will run as always, and he will probably be in a different security domain and doesn't have no knowledge about what we're doing. We can use row hits to get useful information about this. This is very much like cache attacks. Maybe some of you went to the talk earlier by Clementine Maurice and Moritz Lipp about Armageddon, cache attacks on ARM computers. It works pretty much the same way, but it has an advantage over normal cache attacks on the x86. This is that DRAM is shared between CPUs on multi-CPU systems. So it's really shared across the board, meaning it works across CPU as well. So how does it work? Well, we established before that you can have shared rows. That is because the row is 8 kilobyte large and the page is 4 kilobyte large, and the operating system maps in pages. So how do we go about this? Well, we start out by the spy picking a random row which he's not really interested in this case row 0. And he accesses some data in it, and it gets copied to the row buffer, and the data gets returned from there. The spy doesn't really care about the data or the actual row, he just wants to know the state of the row buffer. In this case, he had established that the row buffer should be full with his own memory. And now he activates the shared row that he shares with the victim. This gets copied to the row buffer and returned. And since the spy previously had his own memory in the row buffer from another row, it'll take a long time. He will expect it to be a high timing. You have the row conflict here. However, what if the victim accessed the shared row before the spy activated the shared row? Well, the victim will activate the shared row. It will get copied to the row buffer. He'll get his data that he wanted. And now the spy activates it. But this time it's in the row buffer. He will retrieve the data fast, and he will know that somebody else accessed this row. So imagine if that was handle uppercase, he will be able to tell that your password has an uppercase letter in it. So this brings us to two important questions that turns out to be very much related. What is the chance that we share a row with important victim data? And the second question is, what kind of spatial accuracy do we get? I have to explain this spatial accuracy. Imagine that handle uppercase and handle lowercase are very small functions lying directly next to each other. That means they would fit in the same page, in the same row, and we would be unable to distinguish between them. So the question here is, how far do they have to be apart for us to be able to distinguish uppercase and lowercase functions in this case? And, well, the smallest unit of physical memory is 1 page, as I keep on saying. It's 4 kilobyte large, and rows are still 8 kilobyte large. And we need the victim's address and our address to be in the same row. So you're probably thinking, well, 2 pages share 1 row. Well, you're not exactly right either if you think that. And why? Well, not the entire physical page must be in the same row. And this happens when the mapping function tells the mapping function in the memory controller tells that the page should be distributed over multiple rows. And this happens when the lower bits, which are not translated, the 0 to 11 bits, are used for this mapping. On Skylake, for example, there are low bits that are used for selecting the channel and the bank group, essentially the bank, and thus the physical page gets distributed over 4 rows. Graphically, it looks something like this. You have on the left side the page that we're interested in, where handle uppercase is, and if we have an address in that where the bits are set so that the bank selection and the channel selection is both 0, we will end up in the green row below. And if one of the bits here, the bank group bit, is set to 1, well, we'll end up in the blue, and so on and so forth. Another way to look at this is here in our bank. Here we have a Sandy bridge with a single DIMM, and the mapping function does not have any of the low bits in the lower, does not use any of the bits in the lower 11 to map it, meaning that we get the case that we have been talking about so far, the 2 pages per row. This means we have a spatial accuracy of 1 page, that is 4,096 bytes, and our chance of getting co-located with important victim data is relatively small because we have to get exactly the other color or we can't not see anything. So this doesn't look very promising for spying. But it turns out that Ivy Bridge with 2 DIMM modules have 1 bit in the lower 11 bit, turning out to be 4 pages in a row. This means that we now have 3 colors where we can get our own material in, and then we share a row with the victim. It also means that the victim, the spatial accuracy is now a half page, meaning that we're able to distinguish between handle and uppercase and lowercase if they're only 2,048 bytes apart. And on the latest generation of Intel CPUs, it's much, much better. There are 8 pages per row, 2 bits as you saw before, meaning that you have 7 colors you can pick to get co-location with the victim, and your spatial accuracy is just a quarter of a page. And this sort of looks like a rainbow, which is why I call my Skylake computer Rainbow Dash. Rainbow Dash is a character in the documentary My Little Pony. So, in other words, we can deduct behavior from memory access, much like cached side channel attacks. It works cross VM, cross CPU, even sandboxed, because everybody does memory accesses. There's pretty much no way to avoid memory accesses, no matter what kind of execution environment you have. On the latest generation on personal computers, we are very likely to be in the same row as secret victim information. We have spatial accuracy of 1,024 bytes, which is pretty good. Handle uppercase don't have to be a particularly big function to push handle lowercase out, even if they are located directly beside each other in the code. And it gets even better on multi-CPU servers because often you have a 3rd bit in the lower 11. We have been using this to spy on keyboard input to Firefox, just as doing an example of what we can actually do with this stuff. I should turn it over to Michael here.
So thank you. So spying is a nice thing, but that doesn't explain the demo yet. So we have something else we did. So another attack, and it is a covered channel. So a DRAM covered channel, first of all, we have to say, okay, what is a covered channel? So a covered channel is if you have 2 programs and they would like to communicate with each other. And that sounds pretty normal, but in the case of a covered channel, they are not allowed to do so. So what does it mean? They are not allowed to communicate with each other. All the normal channels are either blocked or monitored. So for example, if you have two programs and they usually communicate over the internet or using files or inter-process communication, shared memory, whatsoever, that's either not available due to hardware or software limitations, or it is monitored. So that means you have a monitoring program running on your computer, and if the monitor detects, oh, these programs they want to communicate, we abort them. So there shouldn't be any communication possible. So we have to exploit some side channels in order to get a communication running between those two programs. And in our case, the side channel is of course the DRAM. So in this animation, we have again a DRAM bank, and I'd like to explain what the primitive here is, that we can use a communication through the DRAM without anyone noticing it, and with no chance to block that. So we have a send and a receiver application, and they agree on some DRAM bank. They can do that beforehand, so it can be hard-coded in the application. It doesn't matter, they can also agree on that. We don't care about how they do it, it can just be hard-coded. And both the sender and the receiver use one row inside this DRAM bank. So you use different rows. And the receiver does nothing else than just reading its data from one row of the DRAM bank. And the receiver is not interested in the data at all, just in the access times. So at the first access, this data will be copied to the row buffer. The timing will be high. We ignore the first reading. But afterwards, every time the receiver accesses data which maps into this DRAM row, it will already be in the row buffer. So the access is really fast, and the receiver sees fast access times and knows its data is in the row buffer. And then the sender can access data in its row. So what happens? The rows are in the same bank, so they have the same row buffer. And if the sender accesses data in its bank, it will be copied to the row buffer. And the old row buffer is gone. So the sender just accesses this, doesn't care about the data. It's just interested in setting the row buffer to a defined state. And if then the receiver again accesses the data in its row, it has to be copied to the row buffer first, because it was overwritten by the sender. And this leads to a high access time. So the receiver sees now it has a high access time, so the transmitter must have sent something by accessing its row. And what is the scenario here? So the scenario is we are trapped inside a virtual machine without network access, as we have seen it in the demo at the beginning of the talk. And there's absolutely no communication between the guest and the host. So imagine you work at a company, you get a virtual machine for malware analysis or with sensitive data in there, and you really don't want to have data going from the VM to the internet. So you have an isolated virtual machine, no communication between guest and host, and then you have a host system that is connected to the internet, but you're not allowed to run any binaries on the host system. You're not allowed to install software there, run something there, with just a normal host system that is monitored. And then you don't have any software bugs. So there are no bugs in the host, in the guest, or in the virtualization software. So absolutely no way to exploit something in software to get data out of the virtual machine. And what is the solution here? We can implement a cover channel in JavaScript. So we have this host system, and most of us will have a browser running on the host system if it's connected to the internet, and therefore we can also run JavaScript inside the browser, which is considered to be safe. And we can use the DRAM as a side channel. Every computer will have DRAM in there, and the DRAM is of course shared between the virtual machine and the host system. So we have a side channel here, we know the timing differences, and we have this JavaScript running on the host system inside the browser. The only thing we have to do is get the victim to visit our page with this JavaScript. So we have also seen that in a demo at the beginning with this Firefox running with the JavaScript on the page, and it was the receiver for the information. And we use this row miss attack primitive we showed before. So the only thing is we have this sender and the receiver agree on a bank at the beginning. So this is hard-coded in the application. We can choose any of the banks. And then inside the VM we have this binary running, this malware or whatever, that wants to exfiltrate the data from the virtual machine to the internet. And in the JavaScript we have this script running that just measures access time to the data. We can measure access time also in JavaScript and see if there was a row conflict or not. And if the sender inside the virtual machine wants to send data out, it accesses its data inside the virtual machine to sender 1. And if it does nothing, then that's interpreted by the JavaScript, just a low access time, as a 0. And it looks something like that. So that's an actual measurement from the JavaScript. We see, we can really see the differences between row conflicts and row hits. So we have this low and this high access times, and we did always a few measurements for every bit, so to be absolutely sure that it's correct. So in this case we did 10 measurements per bit we sent, and we can do an overlay here, use the average, very simple, see the 0 and the 1 bits that are transmitted from the virtual machine to the JavaScript in the browser. And the actual communication is based on packets. We don't want to stream the data, because if we lose one of bits or more bits, then we are out of synchronization and the whole data is corrupted. So we decided to use packets here with a 2-bit preamble to see that there's a packet starting, with an error detection codes, because of course we sometimes have bit flips due to noise or scheduling interrupts. So we have an error detection in there that detects these corrupt packets. Then of course we need a sequence number to have retransmission working. And with that we can reliably transmit data. So the demo at the beginning, we have approximately 11 bits per second. That might not sound very fast, but it's absolutely reliable. You've seen it in the beginning. We have 0% errors, and that can still be improved. So we have multiple ways to improve that. For example, by using fewer retransmissions, which means we have to somehow correct the errors. We only have error detection in there that discards packets that are destroyed, but we could go for error correction, forward error correction, and correct any bit flips we encounter. And then we can also go for multi-threading. The new JavaScript standard allows us to have multi-threading in the browser, so we can transmit multiple bits in parallel using different banks. So we tried that in native code, and we get up to 596 kilobit per second between CPUs and inside a virtual machine. So that's pretty fast, but still for stealing data from a virtual machine to the internet, imagine credit cards or private keys, 11 bits per second without any errors is still fast enough. Good, and now that you know how the demo worked, we have another goodie that we can do with this DRAM reverse engineering.
So many of you probably already thought this is somehow maps to Rowhammer, especially if you were paying attention during the introduction. And it does map quite well. So let me just do a recap of how Rowhammer actually works. The thing with capacitors is that they don't just leak charge when you read them out. They leak charge over time, all by themselves. For this reason, we need to refresh DRAM every once in a while. And how we do that is we read the row into the row buffer and write it back, and the capacitors are all refreshed. This happens every 64 milliseconds in normal computers all the time. The thing is that cells leaks faster upon proximate access. That is, if a neighboring cell is accessed, the cell will leak faster. And this means if we do enough proximate access, bits will start to flip because capacitors will drain from charge, it will no longer be charged, and the bit will be 0 afterwards. So how do we do this in practice? Well, we already know that we can activate a row, copy it into the row buffer, and return it to the CPU from there. Now, because it's already in the row buffer, we need to access another row to get proximate access. So we pick the green row here and access that, and get copied to the row buffer. We have our proximate access, and then we go back to the yellow row, yellow row, and bam, we have bit flips. So this is how Rowhammer works in the 2-minute version. The problem with Rowhammer is, where are the victim row and where are the neighboring rows? Having a gigabytes worth of memory in your computer, you have to search a long time to find actually something that really maps well to victim data, because you don't want anything from the victim, you want the important data. And the first solution by Seaborn and Dulian in their Google blog post was spraying. Spraying is a very old method that hackers have been using for a long time. And it works by filling memory with security relevant information, and just by poor chance you'll hit something randomly if the memory is full of something security relevant. What they did was page table entries. You remember we discussed page table really shortly. This is the entire security system for the memory subsystem of the Intel x86, meaning if you flit a bit in a page table, weird things can happen and security can be severely broken. They also did an attack on the Chrome sandbox, the native client. And here they did not spray page tables, they sprayed sanity checking code. So if somebody write a plugin for a native client in a malicious way, there's lots and lots of sanity checking code in there. And if you start flipping bits randomly at some point in time, you'll hit the sanity checking code, and it will no longer check for sanity, but for insanity, and we have a security break, and we can leave the native client sandbox. A problem with this method is not everything can be sprayed. Imagine attacking a private key. Say you want to flip a bit in a private key so you can factor it afterwards. Well, it's kind of hard to tell a victim that he should copy his private key all over the memory. Life doesn't work that way. So there was a talk here at Black Hat Europe earlier, Flip Feng Shui, and what they figured out was to use deduplication. Deduplication is when an operating system or a virtualizer is idle, you start searching for identical pages in physical memory. Once you find the identical pages in memory, he uses the page table system to map them to the same physical data, so that each client accesses the same physical data, but have their own version of the data. This actually turns out to leak physical addresses. The way it works is you allocate a very large buffer, you start hammering at random, you see where your bit flips are, then you modify the page to match that what you want to break in the attacker, and then you sit around and wait for the deduplication to find your page, merge the page with that of the victim, and then you can start hammering on the same place as you hammered before, and you'll soon flip a bit in the victim's context. The problem with this method is that deduplication is turned off in any serious cloud. The serious is in quotation marks. I actually mean it quite literally. I think if you if you use deduplication in your cloud, you're not a serious cloud provider. Also, it's default off in most operating systems, not just because of Rowhammer, but because there are other attacks on deduplication. It's just a bad idea. So this is where we come in. We know the mapping function, meaning if we have physical addresses of the victim data, then we can actually calculate where his stuff is in DRAM. We can calculate where the rows that we need to attack the victim is. We can calculate everything. And some other researchers, they are quoted here, found out they could actually use that to hit a private key and flip a bit. Once you flip a bit in an RSA key, you can actually factor it and figure out what the real key was. The real problem here is, for this attack to work, you need physical addresses. Classically, we had the proc pitch page map, but that is now privileged in part due to Rowhammer. However, I co-authored a paper recently that showed that on most operating systems we're capable of getting physical addresses from virtual addresses, even unprivileged. And there are other kinds of leaks. For example, should you leave using not using 4 kilobyte pages, but start using large pages, 2 megabyte or 1 gigabyte pages, then you leak a lot of bits of the physical address as well. And the way the cache works actually turns out to leak information about physical addresses as well. So knowing the mapping function actually brings you very, very far in terms of figuring out where the stuff is you want to Rowhammer. There is a very interesting application here. It was once thought that only DDR3 RAM was vulnerable to the Rowhammer problem because testing it did not turn up any bit flips. Turns out that DDR4 is much more resilient to Rowhammer, but it doesn't rule it out. However, knowing the mapping function, we could, as the first team, do bit flips in DDR4 RAM because we could very efficiently target a row. We know the exact neighbors, and we could just start looking for them instead of looking for stuff in the entire memory. And this is what enabled us to do the first bit flips on DDR4 RAM. So there's a fourth solution, and this goes back to the spying stuff. If we're able to invoke victim code, say you can make him use his private key by accessing his website, well, then you can use the row miss primitive to locate the bank where he's in. And if you're very lucky, you get to be in the same row as the victim, and then you can locate the exact row where he is using the spying method we showed before. Of course, this isn't perfect, but it does drastically improve accuracy. If you remember, we're very likely, that is very, very likely to be in the same bank as the victim because a bank is 265 megabytes, meaning we're able to tell what 265 megabytes the attacker, the victim important information is in, and that is a lot less than gigabytes worth of memory. Also, we can map our aggressor rows very efficiently to the same 256 megabytes. And we could get lucky and have row co-location with the victim. Anyways, that is pretty much it for our talk today. We hope that we have made clear that we think that DRAM design is security relevant. We hope we have showed that we can covertly exfiltrate information, that we can spy on other software, and that we can enable efficient and targeted Rowhammer attacks. So if there are any questions, we'll be happy to take them.
What mitigations do you see apart from slowing the DRAM access down so it's consistent?
It's really difficult to mitigate. You saw in the slides that they moved, you put ever more bits into the lower 11. They do that to get more parallelism in the RAM so you can read sequentially. It's really difficult. There is one thing, the cache is in the way for much of this stuff, so if you don't have access to the CL flush instruction, it gets much more difficult, much slower. You lose accuracy. We don't have any really good mitigations. You can do stuff like detect it with performance counters, but you're bound to round up with false positives. So it's a difficult thing. It's a design issue, in my opinion. Not that I know of. Michael, do you know something?
No, not that we know of. No.
One should remember here, it's not really Intel's issue here. The core reason is DRAM, and Intel, to my knowledge, does not produce DRAM. You could probably reproduce these kinds of attack on any processor. It doesn't depend on the processor. It is about the DRAM.
So we also did this attack on ARM, so it works the same on smartphones. And for AMD, for example, they even released the function, so that's not really their problem. And Intel doesn't make it secure by keeping this as a secret. It just made it a step harder for us because we had to reverse engineer it first on Intel and on ARM. But yeah, I don't think they see it as their problem.
You use time save channel to reverse engineer the bank allocation, channel allocation. But how do you identify the neighboring rows? So when you find a victim row, how do you identify the addresses of the neighboring rows to the public?
It turns out that the mapping of the rows is really primitive. So we don't actually do that, but the mapping is really primitive. Any more questions? Okay.
Could you once again put back the slide with the URL or the code on the public, because I forgot to...
Yeah.
Yeah, you know where that is.
It will be hard with this one. Because our laptop is back there. Oh, God.
Maybe you just run over.
Yeah. That would be easy.
If there are any other questions, we can take them meanwhile.
I think it was 5 minutes to 30. That's what I had.
Michael, slide number 30.